We all leave a mark on the world. Some fade quickly, others persist for generations. But few legacies are as fiercely debated as Andrew Jackson's. Have you ever wondered how the actions of one powerful individual can ripple through centuries, shaping the very ground we stand on? Look at your wallet. If you've got a $20 bill, you're carrying Andrew Jackson's face. That placement isn't accidental, and the ongoing fight to remove him from that currency isn't just symbolic politics. It's about reckoning with a ghost. Soft, slightly ominous. Imagine a president whose ghost still walks the halls of power, not just metaphorically, but in the enduring impact of his decisions. Court rulings about native sovereignty still cite precedents from his era. Financial debates about central banking still echo arguments he made in the 1830s. Political candidates still invoke his brand of populism, his suspicion of elites, his claim to speak for the people. But here's the uncomfortable question that shadows all of it. What is the true cost of his legacy, and who is still paying it? This isn't about tearing down a historical figure for sport. It's about understanding how one presidency created reverberations that never stopped, how choices made in the 1820s and 30s shaped land ownership patterns that exist today, how a particular vision of democracy expanded rights for some while systematically crushing others, how the man who positioned himself as the champion of the common man presided over some of the most brutal acts of dispossession in American history. Calm, reflective. By the end of this, you'll understand why Jackson's legacy isn't a simple story of hero or villain. It's something more complicated and more important, a case study in how power works, how it persists, and how we're still living inside decisions made 2 centuries ago. Let's start with the man himself. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 in the Carolina backcountry, a violent frontier where survival wasn't guaranteed. By age 14, he was an orphan. His father died before he was born. His mother and brothers died during the Revolutionary War. He grew up with almost nothing, carrying scars from a British officer's sword and a lifetime grudge against inherited privilege. This wasn't the polished background of a Virginia planter or a Massachusetts lawyer. Jackson clawed his way up through land speculation, law practice, and sheer force of personality. He was a duelist, quick to violence when he felt his honor challenged. He killed a man in 1806 over an insult to his wife. He carried bullets in his body from other confrontations for the rest of his life. But what made Jackson a national figure wasn't frontier brawling, it was war. In 1815, at the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson led a ragtag force of regulars, militia, pirates, and free black soldiers to a stunning victory over British troops. The battle happened after the peace treaty was signed, but news traveled slowly. What mattered was the symbolism, a frontier general defeating the world's most powerful military. He became the American lion, the embodiment of rough-hewn democratic strength. His reputation was built on toughness. His soldiers called him Old Hickory because he seemed as hard and unyielding as the wood itself. He projected an image of incorruptible will, of a man who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But there were contradictions woven into that image from the beginning. Jackson owned enslaved people, dozens of them, on his plantation called the Hermitage near Nashville. He bought and sold human beings while positioning himself as a defender of liberty. He spoke passionately about democracy and self-government while denying both to the people he claimed as property. He championed the common man, but his definition of common had strict boundaries, white men preferably. Native Americans didn't count. Enslaved black people certainly didn't count. Free black people were often losing rights during this period, not gaining them. Women had no political standing at all, and Jackson didn't just accept these contradictions. He built his political career on them. When he ran for president in 1828, he ran as an outsider. The establishment had stolen the election from him in 1824, or so his supporters claimed. Now, he was coming back with the backing of ordinary voters, people tired of East Coast elites and backroom deals. He won in a landslide. And when he took office, he brought that frontier toughness with him. He believed in strong executive power. He believed in loyalty. He believed that he, personally, represented the will of the people in a way that courts and Congress did not. That belief would have consequences that are still unfolding. Let's talk about the Trail of Tears, because if there's one policy that defines the moral cost of Jackson's presidency, it's this. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The law authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties that would exchange native lands in the Southeast for territory west of the Mississippi River. On paper, removal was supposed to be voluntary. In practice, it became a campaign of coercion, fraud, and forced migration. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations had been living in the Southeast for generations. Many had adopted elements of American governance and economy. The Cherokee had a written constitution, a newspaper, farms, schools. They were doing exactly what white reformers claimed they should do, civilizing themselves by American standards. It didn't matter. White settlers wanted the land. They wanted the gold found on Cherokee territory in Georgia, and Andrew Jackson, who had built his military reputation fighting native nations in the Creek War and the First Seminole War, was more than willing to facilitate their removal. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that the state of Georgia had no authority to impose its laws on Cherokee territory. It was a clear assertion of native sovereignty. Jackson's response is often summarized as, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The exact quote is disputed, but the sentiment wasn't. Jackson had no intention of backing the court. Instead, federal and state officials moved forward with removal. The forced marches west began in the mid-1830s and continued into the early 1840s. Families were rounded up, sometimes at gunpoint, often with little warning. They were forced to leave homes, crops, possessions. They were marched hundreds of miles in all seasons, including brutal winters. The death toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but thousands died from exposure, disease, hunger, and violence along the way. The Cherokee alone lost roughly 4,000 people, a quarter of their population, during what they called the Trail Where They Cried. We know it as the Trail of Tears. For white settlers, this was framed as opening land for progress. For native nations, it was dispossession written into law and enforced at gunpoint. And here's what connects this to the present. The legal and moral framework Jackson helped establish didn't end with removal. The fights over sovereignty, treaty rights, and recognition are still active in American courts. Land claims and water rights disputes in the 21st century still reference decisions made in the 1830s. The displacement wasn't a historical event that ended cleanly. It's a structure that persists. Jackson's defenders sometimes argue he believed removal was necessary to prevent violence, that coexistence was impossible. Maybe he believed that. But belief doesn't erase the cost. Thousands of people died, entire nations were uprooted, and the legal reasoning used to justify it, the idea that native sovereignty could be overridden whenever it conflicted with American expansion, became a template for future dispossession. That's the ghost. The policy outlived the man, and it's still shaping the ground we stand on. If this already goes deeper than what you got from a school textbook or a quick meme, you know how this platform works. Long-form, sourced history only survives if you tell the algorithm it matters. If you're finding value here, consider liking this video or subscribing. It's the signal that keeps work like this viable. Now let's shift from land to money, because Jackson's war on the bank created economic shockwaves that are easier to overlook but just as important. In the 1830s, the United States had a central bank called the Second Bank of the United States. It wasn't exactly like the Federal Reserve, but it served similar functions. It held federal deposits, issued currency, regulated credit, tried to stabilize the economy. Andrew Jackson hated it. He saw the bank as a corrupt monopoly that concentrated financial power in the hands of Eastern elites. He believed in hard money, gold and silver, not paper credit that could be manipulated. He thought the bank favored wealthy speculators over ordinary farmers and workers. And when Congress passed a bill to recharter the bank in 1832, Jackson vetoed it. His veto message was populist fire. He framed the bank as a tool of the rich that exploited the poor. He positioned himself as defending the people against a privileged financial class. It was effective politics. He won re-election in a landslide. But policy has consequences beyond the campaign trail. Jackson didn't just veto the recharter. He actively dismantled the bank by removing federal deposits and placing them in state-chartered banks, which critics called pet banks. These banks, with less oversight and more political connections, began issuing credit more freely. Land speculation exploded. Paper money flooded the economy. Jackson tried to cool things down with the Specie Circular in 1836, which required payment for federal land in gold or silver, not paper. But by then, the credit bubble was unsustainable. In 1837, shortly after Jackson left office, the bubble burst. Banks failed, credit dried up, unemployment spiked, people lost their savings. The Panic of 1837 triggered a depression that lasted years. Now, economic crises are complicated. You can't pin the entire panic on one man or one policy. International factors, including British banking practices and global commodity prices, played a role. But Jackson's dismantling of the bank and the resulting credit chaos were significant contributing factors, and the people who got hurt weren't the bankers Jackson despised. They were the ordinary workers and farmers he claimed to represent. If some of this sounds familiar in 21st century debates about central banks, regulation, and who gets bailed out when the economy crashes, that's not a coincidence. Jackson's rhetoric about financial elites versus the people is a recurring chord in American politics. So is the pattern of deregulation followed by crisis, followed by ordinary people bearing the cost. The arguments change. The structure repeats. Jackson believed he was fighting for economic democracy. But his version of democracy assumed that dismantling institutions would automatically benefit the powerless. It didn't account for what happens when credit collapses, when banks fail, when working people lose everything they've saved. That's another part of the ghost. The idea that tearing down systems is inherently liberating without asking who gets crushed in the rubble. Let's zoom out and talk about what Jacksonian democracy actually meant, because it's more complicated than the textbook version. Jackson's presidency did expand political participation. Before his era, many states had property requirements for voting. If you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. During the Jackson years, those requirements eroded, at least for white men. Political parties became mass organizations. Rallies, parades, and partisan newspapers energized voters in ways that felt new and democratic. Jackson himself embodied a new political style. He wasn't a Virginia aristocrat or a New England intellectual. He was rough, direct, and willing to use presidential power aggressively. He used the veto more than all previous presidents combined. He fired federal employees and replaced them with loyalists, pioneering what became known as the spoils system. His supporters saw this as bringing government closer to the people. His critics saw it as consolidating personal power and rewarding cronies. But here's the paradox. Jacksonian democracy expanded rights for some by systematically crushing others. The same period that gave white men more political voice was a period of intensified oppression for everyone else. Native nations were being forcibly removed. Enslaved people remained in bondage, and the domestic slave trade was booming. Free black people, even in the North, often faced new restrictions on voting and movement. Women had no political rights at all. Jackson's people was a selective category. It meant white men, preferably those who agreed with him. Everyone else was outside the circle of democracy, and his political style set a template that echoes in American populism ever since. Suspicion of institutions appeals directly to the people over the heads of elites, courts, and even Congress. Personal loyalty as a core value, a willingness to defy norms if they stand in the way of popular will, as he defined it. This isn't inherently good or bad. Populism can challenge entrenched power. It can give voice to people who've been ignored, but it can also define the people narrowly, exclude whole groups, and concentrate power in the hands of a charismatic leader who claims to speak for the majority. If some of this sounds familiar in 21st century politics across the ideological spectrum, that's because Jackson helped create a language and a style that American leaders still use. The outsider taking on the establishment, the strong executive who won't be bound by courts or conventions, the leader who says he alone understands what the people truly want. That language can be deployed for different ends. But the structure, the appeal, the claim to bypass institutions in the name of popular sovereignty, that goes back to Jackson. So what does Jackson's ghost actually look like in 2025? Start with the currency. The fight over whether Jackson should remain on the $20 bill isn't just symbolic. It's a debate about who we honor, whose legacy we endorse, and whether acknowledging the full cost of that legacy means removing the honor or contextualizing it. Then there are the legal echoes. Cases about native sovereignty, treaty rights, and land claims still reference legal frameworks established or reinforced during Jackson's era. The tension between federal authority and native nations, between state power and treaty obligations, those didn't get resolved in the 1830s. They're still being litigated. The economic debates continue. Arguments about central banking, about regulation versus market freedom, about who gets hurt when financial systems collapse. Those trace back to the bank war. Jackson's rhetoric about elites and the common man is still deployed, often by people who don't know they're channeling him. And then there's the political style. The populist appeal to the people against institutions, the suspicion of courts when they rule against executive power, the idea of a strong president who embodies the popular will and doesn't need to be constrained by technicalities. Modern leaders across the political spectrum reference Jackson, sometimes explicitly, sometimes not. They invoke his outsider energy, his willingness to fight the establishment, his image as a champion of ordinary people against elites. But they rarely reckon with the full cost, the people who were never counted as part of the people, the nations that were dispossessed, the economic crises that followed his financial policies, the way his expansion of democracy for some required the subjugation of others. That selective memory is part of how legacies work. We remember the parts that serve us. We forget the parts that complicate the story. Jackson's ghost walks because we let it, because the structures he built, the precedents he set, the language he used, they're still active, not as relics, but as living frameworks that shape how we argue about power, who counts as the people, and what democracy actually means. So what do we do with a legacy like this? Andrew Jackson was a transformative president. He reshaped the presidency itself, making it a more powerful and personal office. He changed the Democratic Party, turning it into a mass political organization. He embodied a certain kind of American toughness, an outsider energy that still resonates. He was also responsible for policies that caused immense human suffering. The Trail of Tears wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was a deliberate choice. The economic chaos that followed his bank war wasn't unforeseeable. His version of democracy explicitly excluded most of the population. Facing that full picture isn't an act of historical self-hatred. It's what serious countries do. They reckon with their past honestly, not to destroy their heroes, but to understand the real cost of the choices that shape them. Legacies aren't abstract, they're concrete. They show up in land ownership patterns, in legal precedents, in economic systems, in the language we use to talk about power and democracy. Jackson's ghost is real because his decisions are still shaping outcomes. The question isn't whether Jackson was a hero or a villain. The question is, what do we do with the structures he built? Do we reinforce them, reform them, or dismantle them? Do we honor the expansion of rights for some without acknowledging the cost to others? Or do we insist on seeing the whole picture, the achievements and the atrocities, and make conscious choices about which parts of that legacy we want to carry forward? If you found this deep dive valuable, if it challenged what you thought you knew or filled in gaps your textbooks left out, consider subscribing for more evidence-based history that doesn't flinch from complexity. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Jackson's legacy or suggest other figures whose ghosts are still walking. And if you want to support long-form, sourced work like this, hitting the like button tells the algorithm that nuance matters. Andrew Jackson's ghost isn't going away. The choices he made are too embedded in the systems we live with, but understanding how those choices echo, who paid the cost, and who's still paying it, that's how we decide what kind of country we want to be. Not by pretending the past was simpler than it was, but by facing it clearly and choosing deliberately what we do next.